Hi, Waypoints team. Happy Autism Acceptance Week and Trans Week of Action. If you don't know what those two things have to do with each other, that's why I'm here to talk to you today. I'm Jey McCreight. I'm a geneticist and a science communicator who specializes in inclusive language. I'm also transgender and identify as neurodivergent, specifically a special little blend of autism and ADHD. Now, again, you might think, what does being transgender or just having a gender identity that does not match your sex assigned at birth have to do with being autistic? But there's actually a huge amount of overlap between these two communities. Trans people are actually 3 to 6 times as likely to be autistic. There was a recent study in 2017 that looked at over 600,000 people, and those with an official autism diagnosis, that was 4% of cis women, 7% of cis men, and a whopping 24% of gender diverse people, which is really just an umbrella term for anyone who is transgender, non binary, or gender non conforming. Now, this difference in rate, it's not even factoring in people who self-identify as autistic, but may not have the resources or even the desire to receive an official diagnosis. When we look at gender diverse people as a whole, they're actually 5 times more likely to suspect that they have undiagnosed autism compared to cis people, and report way higher rates of traits associated with autism, like systematizing. Now, an official diagnosis, some people don't want that. And I'm actually in that group for people who don't want an official diagnosis for autism. And unfortunately, it's because some doctors view patients with autism as being unable to make sound medical decisions for themselves. And that can even bar people from receiving gender affirming care because some doctors see autism as a thing that needs to be quote unquote cured before someone is ready to make the decision to transition. So that's really problematic, both for people who are trans and for people who are autistic. So I want to come here today and just educate everyone a little bit more about how you can be supportive of people who are autistic and gender nonconforming. Now, why do we see this overlap? A lot of scientists are still doing research in this area, and I don't think there's necessarily a conclusive answer, but I can definitely speak from the point of view of someone who is autistic and trans and has a lot of friends who also identify with both of those groups, and I'm very active in those communities. And I think the shortest way to answer that question is, well, autistic people see the answer as kind of obvious. Us autistic people, we often fail to see the reasoning behind social norms that just feel arbitrary or illogical, rules that don't really have any basis in why they need to exist. That's something that hopefully, as people who work with autistic people, doesn't come as a shocker that autistic people struggle with that kind of thing. And gender norms are a great category for illogical rules that don't really have any meaning effectively. They're cultural, they change over time, they differ between cultures, and ultimately, someone like myself, I don't feel like the way that I dress or act or that I want to be treated by others is defined with the reproductive organs that I popped out with at birth. So that's often why you see a lot of overlap in these communities, and that the way that autistic people view the world, we see gender norms as really arbitrary and not something that we necessarily have to be following, especially compared to someone who is not neurodivergent. So obviously, it's always important to be respectful of trans people and things like pronouns and chosen names, but this is why it's even more important to be considering these things when you are working with clients who are autistic. You're much more likely to run into people who are gender nonconforming. So I received a list of questions that all of you thought would be really useful to have a trans autistic person answer and give some insights for your team. And so I'm going to go through those, and I hope that those help you with your interactions with future autistic clients. And before I even get started, I just want to say thanks again for doing the work you're doing. It's really important that we're offering support to autistic people who, we just have a different way of how our brains work and how we look and interact with the world. And that can be rough sometimes when the world is not built by people like us or for people like us. So thank you again for giving that extra support. So the first question I received was, what should I do if I'm uncertain of someone's gender or pronouns? Now, first I'll just say, you probably don't need to know someone's exact gender identity. As someone offering autistic resources, is it really going to help you to know if I identify as non-binary versus as a trans man? Probably not. More practically speaking, what matters is how are you going to interact with this person? And gender identity doesn't necessarily always equal a specific set of rules. So there are non-binary people who don't use they, them pronouns. There are people who identify more in the binary, like a trans man, who might use they, them pronouns. So you can't assume how someone wants to be talked to just by their gender identity alone. So the first thing I would say is, if you can actually build this into your business practice, have a place where people can report their pronouns. Either a form when they're signing up that just asks them what preferred pronouns do they use, or keep an eye out if they're using pronouns in an email signature or in their Zoom header. People tend to give a lot of hints on what pronouns they want used, especially if they're transgender. So just be aware of what people are already telling you. Likewise, make sure your forms have a place for preferred name. My legal name is not Jey, and I love it when a medical professional or any other really sort of business has a place where I can just tell them this is the name I want to be called, so I'm not automatically being called my legal name. Now, if you're in more casual conversation and you want to make sure you're not misgendering the person, but you also don't want to make them feel on the spot, a good way to do this is to open with just sharing what your own pronouns are. So being like, hey, I'm Jey, nice to meet you. I use they, he pronouns. What's your name? Or if you need a little more prompting, you could say like, what are your pronouns? That's totally fine. What you don't want to do is clock someone as potentially being trans, basically saying, ooh, I can't tell what gender that person is. They must be trans. I'm going to open with, hey, what are your pronouns? Because that can feel really alienating. Like, the other person doesn't know what to think of you, and it can come off as kind of disrespectful, and even in some places, kind of scary. Not everyone is trans friendly, unfortunately. And so if someone is opening with, what are your pronouns? They're basically saying they know you're trans, and that could be a security risk in some cases. So don't be aggressive. Don't necessarily open just with that. Just work it into normal conversation if it's not in a form. Hi, I'm Jey. I use these pronouns. Nice to meet you. And if they want to tell you your pronouns, they will then tell you their pronouns. Now, another question I received is, what if the person is not able to tell me their gender or pronouns themselves? Now, this is a trickier situation, of course. It's hard to say, oh, just guess. But in some cases, guessing is the right thing to do. If someone is coming in and they are dressed in very obvious feminine ways with like long hair, makeup, a dress, it's probably safe to use she, her, and if they don't feel comfortable with that, they will probably tell you, no, I use they, them pronouns. And the point there is to just not beat yourself up about using the wrong one. Don't apologize profusely, because then you're really just, again, making it awkward for the trans person. They feel like then they have to be the one managing your emotional reaction and making you feel better about messing up. So if someone corrects you, just use the correct pronouns from there on, and you're fine. Now, if it's someone who, their presentation is a little more ambiguous, they're not conforming to kind of strict gender roles, they're not like me and they have facial hair and they're wearing a collared shirt, I never get called anything by a stranger other than he, him, or sir in public, which is I'm fine with. But let's say there's someone who's more gender non-conforming, you really can't tell, and you don't want to make a mistake. They, them is a gender-neutral pronoun, singular, and you can use they, them to even describe cisgender people when maybe gender isn't relevant to a story you're telling. That's something I always say is, hey, if I'm talking about the cashier who was checking me out at the grocery store, I can say that they told me a funny joke. Does it really matter if it was a man or a woman or a non-binary person who was telling the joke? No, it's more about the story. So if you really can't tell, you're unsure, you can default to they, them pronouns. But again, listen to feedback. So, for example, if they're ever talking about themselves, listen to what pronouns they use to describe themselves, or if they're using certain gendered terms, and try to pick up on that. The one thing you don't want to do is, again, you clock someone as trans, you think, oh, I think this is a trans person, I'm going to only use they, them, because that must be the right way. If you notice that I am only referring to myself as himself, or I have he, him in my Zoom header or my email signature, don't use they, them for me. Again, that's disrespectful. You're basically not listening to what the person is telling you information-wise. Just try to match up with what you're receiving. Now, another question I got is there anything I can do to support clients who are exploring their gender identity? And yes, I would say the number one thing is to just be willing to go on that journey with them and to use the terms they ask you to use. So if maybe you have a client who you started working with before they came out as trans or realized they were trans or just started playing with new pronouns or names, that's a really common experience for a trans person to go through, is just testing out new pronouns or new names. And I know I went through that myself. In the beginning, I used she, they, then I used they, them, and I finally kind of solidified on they, he. Either they, them, or he, him pronouns feel good for me. So if a client comes in and they're saying, oh, actually, I kind of want to try out they, them pronouns, just try it out for them. You will make someone feel so supported because you're just making an effort to use the terminology that makes them feel respected. So just try it out. Or if they're like, hey, actually, I'm trying out a new name. I'm going by Jey now. Please call me Jey. Use their new name and accept that, maybe in a couple weeks they decided, actually, I didn't feel comfortable with that, or I'm trying out a different name. Just be flexible and go on that journey with them and use the terms that they like. And I think a lot of people understand this when dealing with clients who aren't trans, who have name preferences. If you get introduced to a new client and their legal name is Robert and that's who you thought you were going to be talking to, but they're like, oh, I really go by Bob, hate being called Robert, you wouldn't keep calling that person Robert, right? You'd call them Bob. It would just be rude to not use the name that they actually prefer to be called. And people have all sorts of reasons why they have a specific name they like. Maybe they use their middle name because their first name brings back bad memories for whatever reason or has a weird association. Maybe they just like it better. Maybe it's a cultural thing. So just, again, be respectful. Go with people on that journey with them. And I would say as a business, it's great if you have these built into forms. So like if there's a user profile that someone can go in and change their pronouns or change their given name, and it's flagged internally that like, hey, your client actually updated this. Make sure you see this before the next time you speak with them. That's way less invasive and puts a lot less pressure on the trans person to have to like awkwardly have that conversation with you. Especially because, again, a lot of people aren't trans friendly and aren't going to be accepting. And so it takes that onus off of having to be the person to start an awkward conversation and not be sure how someone's going to react to it. So if you can put it in forms that are kind of behind the scenes, that's a much less stressful way for a trans person to have to update those sort of things. Now, another question I got was, how can I best support people whose gender identity changes from day to day? So this would be a gender fluid person. Now, I'm not gender fluid. I just want to put that out there. So I'm speaking for a group that I don't necessarily identify with. But again, I would say it's similar advice as what I've been saying in that, listen to terms that people use for themselves. If they're referring to themselves in a different way on that given day, go with the flow, pick up on those kind of social cues and use that as well. But if you have a good relationship with the person and maybe they've discussed that they're gender fluid and that their gender identity changes, and like you already kind of know this is a thing, it just might become a practice for you for every meeting. Be like, hey, nice to see you. Are there any pronouns you want me to use for you today? Just, and not make it a big deal, because you've already had that conversation, you know this is a thing. And I think, again, most people, trans people, especially if they're gender fluid and you know that this is a thing, they'll just see that as you being respectful, because you want to know how to address them in an appropriate way. So, again, open conversation and just read the room. Like, if you asking their pronouns every session is actually making them feel awkward, or you can tell they're getting resolved, maybe don't do that method for that particular person. Maybe you can even just ask them, hey, if you're gender fluid, how do you want to go about this so I can treat you respectfully? Do you want to send an email to me before we talk and let me know? Should I default to they, them? Should I base it off of your appearance that day? Again, a lot of this is an open conversation, and it's going to depend on the relationship you have with the person. So don't be pushy. Just make it clear that you're coming from a place of wanting to be respectful and supportive, but also don't ask so much that you're necessarily badgering a person. And I'll say one safe way to do it, this isn't an optimal situation, but you can speak trying to avoid using pronouns. Again, it's awkward. If someone was in conversation saying, well, Jay said this and Jay needs that, I would feel awkward with that because I make it very clear what my pronouns are. I have it in my signature. I have it in my profile. I tell people my pronouns are. So I want people to use them. So when they use it, just the name, it feels like avoiding acknowledging that I'm trans. But for some gender fluid people, that may be better than making a mistake. So again, just about having that conversation. Now, another question I received was, can you think of any common ways that, quote unquote, traditional gender roles are enforced in day-to-day life that I can be aware of and avoid when working with children? And I admit, my initial reaction to this is, yikes. There are traditional gender roles that are enforced from birth on all children. And I really think that step one is just recognizing that this happens. We have gender reveal parties where we assume that a child, because they pop out with a certain set of reproductive organs, are going to have a certain gender identity their whole life. And that's not going to be the case for at least 1% of the population who are trans or gender non-conforming. So don't make assumptions in general. Are you going to children and joking that a little boy has a girlfriend because he's just talking to another girl? I mean, you're basically telling this child that everyone is assumed to be heterosexual, which sexual orientation is another issue other than gender identity. Trans people can have any sexual orientation. But like, you're reinforcing this idea that boys act a certain way and boys like girls, girls act a certain way and like boys, which again, this isn't the case for some people. So don't assume that boys are inherently better at science and math, or that girls are inherently more behaved or empathetic. Also, a lot of stuff with like gendered clothing, which I don't know if that's going to come up as much in like your roles as people supporting trans kids instead of like a parent, but I know personally that was a big source of stress for me as a trans kid, and that my mother really associated wearing a dress with being appropriately dressed. Like, if you're going to a formal event, little girls wear dresses, and it would be poor manners to not put me in a dress. But forcing me to wear a dress instead of wearing pants, which is what I wanted to wear, was such an immense source of stress and emotional anguish growing up. And that's a really common narrative for a lot of trans masculine people. So again, just kind of check yourself when you're looking in the world and you're looking at how you're interacting with someone. Just like have a running narrative in your mind of, would I treat this child differently if I thought they were a different gender? And why am I doing that? Do I actually have to treat them differently or have different assumptions? Or are those assumptions based in gender norms that aren't necessarily true for all people? So I think it's just a matter of, again, awareness and self consciousness and checking yourself when you're making those assumptions. Now, finally, I got an open-ended question on what's the best way for me to support trans people right now, which I could probably go on about that for an hour, especially just given the current political climate, which, if you haven't been paying attention, it's not a great time to be trans, especially in the United States, especially in the UK, really across the world. There's been a huge pushback lately as more and more people have felt safe enough to come out as trans finally and live their authentic lives. A lot of people feel threatened by that and are invested in enforcing strict gender norms for a wide variety of reasons. And we're seeing so much legislation come out trying to basically erase trans people and stop trans people from being able to exist in public spaces and thus exist at all. So really, one, I would say be educated, be aware of what is going on. If you are only reading mainstream media sources, you probably don't really know what's happening with trans people because unfortunately, mainstream media, all those reporters are cisgender people. They don't platform trans people. They often platform people who are explicitly transphobic and hate trans people or are invested in getting rid of us. So even outlets like the New York Times have been really criticized lately because they're platforming what is effectively anti-trans propaganda and a lot of misinformation about trans people. So look for sources that you can trust on trans issues. So look for organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, like GLAAD. Look for trans individuals who are involved in trans rights or who are trans journalists and see what they're writing about current events. So Chase Strangio at the ACLU is a trans man who is always putting out amazing information on social media about what's going on with recent legislation and how people can help. Erin Reed, she is another wonderful trans journalist who is also keeping tabs on a lot of the legislation that's going on. So again, try to find trans voices and listen to them about what's going on. So two, I would say if you're in a state where trans people are under attack by legislation, which unfortunately is basically every state in the United States at this point, write your representatives. Find out who your representatives are, your congresspeople, your governor, and send them a message and be like, hey, I'm cisgender, or maybe you're not, maybe you're transgender, and I don't support all these attacks on trans people. I believe that trans people have the right to access medically necessary gender-affirming care, which, again, you might not know this, but gender-affirming care, which has been really in the news lately, especially on trans youth receiving it, it's accepted and supported by every medical major organization. Amongst scientists and doctors, there is no debate on if trans-affirming care or gender-affirming care for trans people should happen or not. This is a decision between doctors and a trans patient or doctors and the parents of a trans child. It's not up to politicians who know nothing about science. So write your politicians, tell them you are against bans on gender-affirming care, you support trans people being able to use the bathroom of their choice, you support trans people in sports. Ultimately, trans people are not a threat. We are just trying to live our lives and not be harassed in the process, and we're really being made out to be a boogeyman and a distraction from other political issues that are actually important. So, write your representatives. And the final point I would make is to just be vocal. Trans people, we only make up about 1% of the population. We're even more rare than lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual people. So even amongst the queer community, we're in a minority. We don't have as many voices just out there speaking up for us. And if it's only trans people speaking up, we're going to get drowned out by the sheer number of people who really fundamentally hate us or are scared of us. So we need allies. Are you willing to correct a friend or a relative who's spreading misinformation online or making really mean transphobic jokes? Will you be willing to post something on social media, maybe for Trans Day of Visibility, that on the 31st of March, that just says, hey, I support trans rights. I support trans people being able to exist. Trans people are people, they're not scary. Just being able to put out those sort of supportive messages. Not only are you going to show the trans people in your life that, like, hey, I actually have your back. I'm willing to do what's really the bare minimum, is to vocally say, I'm okay with trans people, and I think people who aren't need to back off. Like, that means so much to a trans person. And ultimately, you might change the minds of people who are on the fence, are just less educated, just have never maybe met a trans person before. And I hate to say it, but it might mean more coming from someone who isn't trans to hear that, oh, it's not a weird thing to accept trans people. Maybe I should start thinking about this more. So share resources with those people, be vocal, and just don't be silent. Especially the next couple years are going to matter a lot, not just related to elections, which are always a big thing, but there's definitely a lot of stuff happening culturally with trans people right now. When I talk to my 76-year-old father about it, who, I mean, he's never interacted with any queer people at all his whole life, very Midwestern kind of guy, but supports me, loves me, calls me his son to every stranger we run into, whether it's a waiter or we're getting groceries. And I can't tell you how much it means to me to just have him affirm me around other people and to not be ashamed that he has a trans kid. Just being vocal matters so much. And, when he looks at all this, he says to me, Jay, this seems like just where we were with gay people 20 years ago, where everyone thought they were weird, and now no one cares. And you know what? My dad's right. There's this pushback where a certain small but vocal segment of society who hates trans people are really scared and threatened that it's becoming socially okay to come out of the closet as trans. And there's going to be a lot of pushback while those things change culturally, but ultimately, trans people are here to stay. We are a natural part of human diversity. We have existed throughout human history and throughout time, just like autistic people have. Just not all humans come out the same way, and that's okay. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It doesn't mean we need to be cured, that we don't need to be seen from this like paternalistic viewpoint where we need saving. We just need people to accept us for who we are and to know that you can't get rid of us. We're going to continue to pop out for the rest of the time just because we're part of the human condition. So I hope all of this is helpful. I appreciate you listening to this little virtual talk. And again, just educate yourself. Find more articles to read about trans people. Find more articles to read about how trans and autistic people intersect. I'm going to leave some links so that you can do your own research afterward and do some more reading. But again, thanks for just listening, because that's really step one of the process, is being willing to learn and grow and learn something new. So thanks again for hosting me.